Tonight, we're going to talk about a plant. Not just any plant, mind you, but the one that's been quietly outsmarting humanity for the better part of 10,000 years. Cannabis, weed, ganja, herb, whatever your ancestors called it, while coughing politely into a fur sleeve. It's the story of how humans discovered fire's most philosophical accident and then spent the next several millennia arguing about whether it was medicine, magic, or a moral emergency. Before we get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy drifting off to strange corners of history. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. It's always oddly comforting to know someone in Norway is falling asleep at the same moment as someone in Brazil. Now, dim the lights, adjust the pillow, maybe pull the blanket up a little higher, and let's ease into tonight's slow, smoky ramble through the ancient world. Picture the Stone Age, not the cartoon version with the saber-toothed pets and the funny clubs, but the real one, where survival was a full-time job and dental care was a rumour. We're somewhere around 8000 BC, maybe 1000 in what we'd now call Central Asia. Rolling steppes, grass taller than most children, wind that smells faintly of horse and rain. Somewhere in this vast, quiet nowhere, a small band of humans has just discovered fire well enough to keep it lit for more than 5 minutes, which was considered advanced technology. Life was hard. Life was cold. Life mostly involved arguing over the last piece of dried mammoth. And into this world, unnoticed and uninvited, grew a scrappy little green plant that would eventually spend the next 10,000 years causing every civilization to slowly lose its mind. At first, nobody was smoking it. Let's clear that up. Early humans weren't rolling joints. They didn't even know what a joint was. They didn't know what leisure was. The idea of doing something for fun was probably still centuries away. What they knew was that this plant, whatever it was, had strong fibres, really strong, stronger than most of the other plants around, which mostly just turned to sad damp mush when you tried to twist them into anything useful. So the first thing humans did with cannabis was, of all things, laundry technology. They made rope. They made nets. They made rough, itchy garments that probably felt like being hugged by a cactus, but at least they didn't fall apart in the rain. Cannabis, or hemp as we'd come to call the boring cousin of the party plant, was quietly holding early human society together, literally. Every fishing net, every tent lashing, every crude sandal strap, all thanks to a plant that would later be blamed for everything from communism to bad music. The seeds were also edible, nutritious actually, full of protein and oils. So during the long lean stretches of winter when the mammoths had wandered off and the berries were gone, humans would chew on hemp seeds and stare into the middle distance, unaware that their descendants would one day pay premium prices for the exact same thing in health food stores. It's humbling in a way. Everything old becomes new again, even snacks. Now somewhere along the line, and no one can point to a specific date because Stone Age people were terrible about keeping journals, someone tossed a cannabis plant onto a campfire. Maybe it was accidental. Maybe they were using it as kindling and didn't realise what they'd grabbed. Maybe they were burning old rope. But the moment those flowering tops hit the flames, something strange happened. The smoke smelt different. Sweeter, heavier, and after a few deep, confused inhalations, the person tending the fire probably sat down harder than they meant to, blinked at the stars, and said the prehistoric equivalent of, well, that's new. From that moment on, humanity was never quite the same. Not because everyone immediately became a stoner, but because a door had cracked open. A small, herbal, slightly sticky door. For most early humans, this experience would have been more terrifying than delightful. Imagine being one of the first people to accidentally get high without knowing what getting high even was. There's no reference point. There's no friend saying, "Just ride it out, buddy, there's no soft music." It's just you, a fire, a confused cousin next to you, and suddenly the trees look like they know something you don't. The gods must have been speaking. That was the only reasonable explanation. And so, from the very beginning, cannabis was tangled up with the spiritual. Not because it was magical, but because early humans had absolutely no other category to put it in. Anything that changed the way you felt, saw, or thought must be divine. It was that or admit that a plant had just put one over on you, and human pride wasn't ready for that conversation yet. Archaeologists working in Siberia and Central Asia have found cannabis seeds in ancient burial mounds, tucked in with the bones of people who died thousands of years ago. Which means someone, somewhere, thought highly enough of this plant to send it into the afterlife with a loved one. That's not something you do with just any weed. You don't get buried with a dandelion. But cannabis got that honour. Whether it was a sacred ritual, a personal comfort, or a Stone Age version of he would have wanted this, we'll never know. But the message across the millennia is clear. This plant mattered. It mattered enough to be carried into the darkness with the dead. Meanwhile, back among the living, cannabis was spreading. Slowly, patiently, without any effort on its own part. Because that's the trick of cannabis, and honestly the trick of most successful things in nature. It didn't need to conquer. It just had to be useful enough that humans would carry it everywhere they went, and humans, being humans, absolutely did. Wherever they wandered, from the frost-bitten edges of Siberia down through the fertile river valleys of what would become China, the plant went with them. In sacks, in seed pouches, in the folds of clothing, cannabis was hitchhiking through history, and nobody realized it was already writing itself into the story of civilization. By around 5000 BC, we start seeing real evidence of cannabis being cultivated intentionally. That's the key word. Not just gathered wild, but planted, tended, harvested, which means somewhere along the way, a farmer looked at this plant and said, "You know what? I want more of that." And a deal was struck. Not a formal one, of course. There was no contract, no handshake, but an agreement was reached between species. Humans would give cannabis fertile soil, sunlight, and protection from grazing animals. And cannabis would give back fibres, seeds, oil, medicine, and yes, occasionally, a very confused evening around the fire. It's worth pausing here, in the quiet of the night, to appreciate what a strange partnership this was. Cannabis is one of the earliest cultivated plants in human history. Older than wheat, in some estimates. Older than rice in others. Which means that before we figured out how to reliably grow the food that would build entire civilizations, we had already figured out how to grow this. That says something about our priorities as a species. It says something warm, actually. It says that even at the very beginning, before writing, before cities, before laws, we were already interested in more than just filling our stomachs. We wanted comfort. We wanted texture. We wanted to feel just a little bit different than we had the day before. And this plant delivered. Cannabis probably originated somewhere in Central Asia, in the shadow of the great mountain ranges. The Altai Mountains, the Tian Shan, the Himalayas. These are cold, rugged places where you don't expect much of anything to thrive, and yet cannabis absolutely loved it there. It grew wild and tall, sometimes reaching heights that would embarrass a modern grower. Whole valleys full of it, waving in the wind, waiting for someone to notice. And notice they did. The nomadic peoples who moved through these regions, the ancestors of everyone from the Scythians to the Mongols, carried cannabis with them like a family recipe. From these highlands, the plant began its slow, patient migration outward, drifting east into China, south into India, west into Persia, and eventually into every corner of the known world. And in every place it landed, humans came up with a slightly different reason to love it. In some regions it was a fabric, in others a food, in some a medicine, in others a sacred sacrament for talking to gods. In a few, all of these at once. The plant was endlessly flexible, and humans were endlessly creative in finding new ways to justify keeping it around. There was never a moment when someone said, "We really don't need this cannabis anymore." There was always a use, always a reason, always a slightly guilty smile. By the late Stone Age, cannabis had established itself as one of the most quietly influential plants in human history. It didn't have the drama of grain, which built kingdoms. It didn't have the sweetness of fruit, which fed empires. It didn't have the poetry of wine, which would come later and steal all the headlines. But it was there, in the background, holding up sails, wrapping the dead, feeding the hungry, and occasionally, when the fire was just right, and the mood was just so, opening a small, strange window in the human mind. A window that we've been peeking through ever since, and this, dear listener drifting slowly towards sleep, is only the very beginning. Because from these humble Stone Age origins, cannabis was about to embark on one of the great slow-motion journeys in world history. It was going to meet emperors, poets, mystics, warriors, priests, and eventually a great many politicians who would be very upset about it. It was going to inspire scriptures, start rumours, and become simultaneously the most sacred and the most suspicious plant on earth. It was going to travel further than most nations, be renamed in dozens of languages, and outlive every empire that tried to ban it. And it was going to do all of this while barely lifting a leaf. Now we drift forward in time, gently, the way smoke drifts through a still room. We leave the Stone Age behind, with its fur cloaks and its confused campfire epiphanies, and we arrive in ancient China. It's roughly 2700 BCC. The pyramids of Egypt are still just an idea in someone's ambitious head. Most of Europe is still figuring out which end of a shovel is up, but in China, civilization is already humming along nicely. There are villages, there are rice paddies, there are bureaucrats. Yes, bureaucrats. That's how you know a civilization has truly arrived. The moment someone starts filling out forms about grain storage, you've made it. And presiding over all of this, at least according to legend, is a figure who sounds too good to be true, which is usually a sign that half of him wasn't. His name was Shen Nung, the divine farmer. And his job, if you can believe it, was to personally taste every plant in the empire to see which ones were medicine, and which ones were, shall we say, terminal. He was a walking clinical trial with no lab coat, no consent forms, and absolutely no exit strategy. Historians debate whether he actually existed or was more of a folk hero patched together from generations of anonymous herbalists. But the Chinese remembered him as the man who ate the world, so the rest of us wouldn't have to. And that, honestly, deserves a moment of quiet respect. Because whoever really did this work, and someone did, they gave us the beginnings of medicine. Now, somewhere in his taste-testing marathon, Shen Nung came across cannabis. And unlike some of the other plants he encountered, which reportedly caused him to turn various alarming colours before he found the antidote, cannabis did something more interesting. It didn't kill him. It didn't even seem to hurt him. It just made him feel, according to the story, unusually calm. Focused, a little sleepy perhaps, his muscles unwound. His headache eased. He looked at his notes and thought, you know what? This one goes in the book. And into the book it went. The book in question was the Pen Sao Ching, sometimes called the Divine Farmer's Materia Medica. It's one of the oldest medical texts in the world, and it reads a bit like a strange mixture of pharmacy manual, spiritual guide, and shopping list. Cannabis, or ma as the Chinese called it, was listed as a treatment for a truly impressive range of complaints. Rheumatism, gout, malaria, menstrual cramps, constipation, absent-mindedness. That last one is delightful, because cannabis is famously not the cure for absent-mindedness. Cannabis is the cause of absent-mindedness. But apparently, in ancient China, if you took enough of it, you eventually forgot you were absent-minded, which technically counts as a cure. Elegant, really. The Chinese approach to cannabis was refined, methodical, and deeply unfun. They didn't smoke it. They didn't roll it. They didn't pass it around at parties. In fact, they seemed to disapprove of parties in general. The Confucian influence over Chinese culture was strong, and Confucians did not believe in losing control of oneself. Losing control was for foreigners and the criminally impolite. So instead of getting high, the Chinese ground cannabis into powders, brewed it into teas, mixed it with wine, and packaged it into ointments. It was medicine, plain and simple. Or at least that's what everyone officially claimed. Because you and I both know that when a doctor tells an ancient Chinese peasant that they need to drink cannabis wine 3 times a day for their back pain, that peasant is not going to complain about the side effects. The medical texts of the era treated cannabis with the same seriousness as any other herb. There were dosages. There were warnings. There were combinations to avoid. Ancient Chinese pharmacology was, in many ways, remarkably advanced. They understood that plants had different effects at different doses. They knew that mixing certain herbs could enhance or negate their properties. They knew about heat and cold, yin and yang, the balance of the body's energies. Cannabis fit neatly into this system as a plant of cooling, calming influence, which is a very polite way of saying that it made stressed-out people less stressed. In a society ruled by rigid etiquette and endless family obligations, this was a valuable service indeed. Somewhere in ancient China, there was undoubtedly a very tired mother-in-law being medicated for the sake of the entire household's sanity. But cannabis in China wasn't just a medicine. It was, quietly, everywhere. The Chinese had discovered something that would make the plant one of the most important agricultural products in their history. They could turn its fibres into cloth. Not just rough peasant cloth, but proper cloth. Cloth you could wear to a temple. Cloth you could bury a nobleman in. Cloth that would last through winters and washings and the general indignities of daily life. Hemp fabric became the everyday textile of ancient China, worn by everyone from farmers to minor officials. Silk was for the wealthy. Hemp was for the rest of humanity, which is to say, most of humanity. If you lived in China any time between about 3000 BC and, well, the invention of cotton several thousand years later, chances are the clothes on your back were made of cannabis. Now think about that for a moment as you lie there in the dark. For thousands of years, in the largest and most populous civilization on Earth, most people spent every day of their lives, from the morning they were born to the evening they died, wearing cannabis, sleeping under cannabis sheets, wiping their hands on cannabis cloths, fishing with cannabis nets, wrapping their babies in cannabis swaddling. It's almost funny how thoroughly the plant infiltrated daily life without anyone thinking twice about it. It was as ordinary as water, and about as commented upon. Then came the paper. The paper. Around 100 BC, give or take a century, the Chinese figured out how to turn hemp fibres into paper. Real paper. Thin, flexible, writable paper. This was a revolution the world had never seen. Before hemp paper, if you wanted to write something down, you had to carve it into bamboo strips or scratch it onto silk, both of which were expensive, awkward, and made libraries very heavy. Hemp paper changed everything. Suddenly, writing was cheap. Suddenly, ideas could travel. Suddenly, a scholar in one province could copy a text and send it to another. And the world became just a little bit more connected. The earliest known pieces of paper ever found were made from hemp, which means, technically, the first written words humanity ever produced on paper were written on cannabis. Somewhere out there, a Taoist monk was probably scribbling a lecture on the dangers of intoxication onto a page that was itself made of the very plant he was warning about. History has a sense of humour if you know where to look. And then there was the rope. Miles and miles of rope. Chinese ships were rigged with hemp. Chinese wells were drawn with hemp. Chinese archers strung their bows with hemp. It was the industrial fibre of the ancient world, and China was the industrial capital of the ancient world. Entire villages were dedicated to growing, harvesting and processing hemp. There were hemp guilds, hemp merchants, hemp inspectors. There was probably, somewhere in the imperial bureaucracy, a Ministry of Hemp Quality Assurance, staffed by very serious men with very long titles. Because if there's one thing empires love, it's turning something simple into something complicated. Meanwhile, on the mystical side of Chinese culture, the Taoists were quietly having their own conversation with cannabis. The Taoists were a philosophical tradition that valued nature, spontaneity, and the mysterious flow of the universe. They spent a lot of time in the mountains, watching clouds, writing poetry about clouds, and occasionally trying to become immortal through very complicated alchemical experiments that mostly did not work. Cannabis fit right in. Some Taoist texts mention using cannabis in incense burners during meditation and divination rituals. The idea was that the smoke would help the mind slip loose from the body and drift toward higher truths. Whether it actually did this or just made the meditator very hungry is a matter of interpretation. But the Taoists were not shy about admitting that certain plants could help open the doors of perception, long before anyone had a phrase like doors of perception to describe it. There's a lovely image in some of the old Taoist writings of the immortal seer sitting in a small hut, burning cannabis alongside other herbs, watching the smoke curl upward and receiving visions of the future. Whether those visions were accurate is anyone's guess. But the practice was real, and it was one of the earliest examples in recorded history of humans deliberately using cannabis to alter their consciousness for a spiritual purpose. Not for fun, not for pain relief, but specifically to see something they couldn't see with clear eyes. That's a very different relationship with the plant than the Confucians officially endorsed. And it hints at something that would become a recurring theme in cannabis history. Wherever cannabis went, two cultures always seemed to grow up around it. The official culture, which treated it as medicine and material, and the unofficial culture, which treated it as a key. By the time the Han Dynasty rolled around, cannabis was so thoroughly woven into Chinese life that it barely registered as anything unusual. It was in the fields, in the clothes, in the books, in the medicine chests, and quietly in the incense burners of certain wandering monks. The empire was built on it, though no one bothered to say so. Emperors and peasants alike lived inside a vast, invisible cannabis ecosystem, and it never occurred to any of them that this might one day be considered strange. But cannabis, patient as always, wasn't content to stay in China. The trade routes were opening, merchants were moving, and somewhere out there, on the wind-swept steppes to the north and west, another culture was about to meet cannabis in a very different way, a way that didn't involve any bureaucracy at all. Now we drift north, up out of the ordered rice paddies and the tidy little Confucian villages, up into the vast open grasslands that stretch from the edge of China all the way to the shores of the Black Sea. This is the steppe. And if you've never stood on the steppe, imagine an ocean, but made of grass, and instead of waves, there is only wind. It goes on forever. Genuinely, unnervingly forever. You could ride a horse in one direction for a month, and the landscape would barely change. Just grass, just sky, just the occasional startled marmot. It's the kind of place that makes you either deeply spiritual or slightly mad, depending on the weather. And the people who lived here roughly around 1000 BC were called the Scythians. Now the Scythians are one of those civilizations that history books tend to skip past, because they didn't build great pyramids or write long philosophical treatises. They were nomads. They rode horses. They fought a lot. They tattooed themselves head to toe with intricate designs of stags and griffins and coiled serpents. They wore trousers, which the Greeks found absolutely scandalous, because civilized men wore robes and only barbarians hid their legs in fabric tubes. The Scythians did not care what the Greeks thought. The Scythians did not care what anyone thought. They were possibly the least self-conscious people who have ever existed. And they loved cannabis. Loved it. Not politely, not medicinally, not with careful dosages and long treatises. They loved it the way you love a favourite blanket, the way you love the smell of rain, the way you love something that just feels right and doesn't need to be explained. If the Chinese approach to cannabis was let us study this carefully and record its properties in 17 volumes, the Scythian approach was throw more of it on the fire, and history, sleepy listener, is much more amusing because of it. The most famous account of Scythian cannabis use comes from the Greek historian Herodotus, who travelled widely and wrote down basically everything he saw or was told about. whether it was true or wildly exaggerated. Herodotus was the world's first travel blogger, and he had all the credibility that implies. But in this case, his description of Scythian funeral rites has been backed up by archaeology, so we can actually trust him. Which is a rare and beautiful moment in ancient history. Here's what he described. When someone important died among the Scythians, the family would gather for a ritual of mourning and purification. They would set up small tent-like structures, essentially wooden frames covered with felt or leather. Inside they would place a bowl of hot stones, and then, onto these stones, they would throw handfuls of cannabis flowers and seeds. The tent would immediately fill with dense, sweet, powerful smoke, and then the mourners would climb inside and just, breathe deeply for a long time. Herodotus wrote that they would howl with delight, which is a wonderful phrase because it manages to be both accurate and deeply undignified. These were grieving warriors, remember, tough men and women with weapons and battle scars sitting in a smoke-filled tent, howling. It's one of the most human scenes in all of ancient history. Now here's where it gets even better. Herodotus was writing about this in the 5th century BC, and for centuries scholars assumed he was just making it up or exaggerating for his Greek readers who loved a good story about weird foreigners. But then in the 20th century, archaeologists started digging up Scythian burial mounds in the Altai Mountains and southern Siberia. And what did they find? Wooden tent frames, bowls of hot stones, charred cannabis seeds. Every detail Herodotus had described, sitting there in the frozen earth, waiting for 2,500 years to be vindicated. Old Herodotus, wherever he is in the afterlife, is presumably grinning ear to ear. But the archaeologists found something else too, something even more remarkable. In one particularly wealthy Scythian burial in what is now Kazakhstan, they unearthed a set of golden bowls. Not iron, not clay, solid gold. Beautifully worked, decorated with battle scenes, meant clearly for someone of enormous importance. And when they analysed the residue inside those bowls, they found traces of cannabis and opium, which tells us that at least some Scythians didn't just tolerate this ritual practice. They funded it lavishly. They wanted the best cannabis in the best bowls, served in the most ceremonial way possible. If you were a Scythian noble, you did not go into the afterlife without your equipment. It's the kind of commitment to lifestyle that you have to admire, even if you disapprove. The purpose of these smoke rituals, at least officially, was purification. The Scythians didn't have easy access to water for bathing, especially in the winter, so they used the smoke as a kind of ritual cleansing. The heat would open the pores, the sweet smoke would perfume the skin and hair, and the whole experience would leave you feeling both clean and, transformed. It was a spa day and a religious ceremony rolled into one. And unlike modern spa days, this one came with visions. Because the Scythians didn't just do this for hygiene, they did it to commune with the dead, to honour them, to bridge, however briefly, the impossible gap between this world and the next. Sitting in that smoky tent, surrounded by other mourners, breathing air so thick with cannabis that reality itself became a suggestion, they believed they could hear the voices of the departed, feel their presence, say the things they had not managed to say in life. It was grief therapy, group therapy, and spiritual practice all folded into one. And whether or not the ancestors were actually listening, the ritual clearly worked. Because it lasted for centuries. It spread from tribe to tribe. It became one of the defining features of Scythian culture. And here's where the story gets philosophical, sleepy listener. Because think about what the Scythians were doing. They were using cannabis, which is technically a psychoactive substance, in a very intentional, structured, communal way. They weren't hiding it. They weren't ashamed of it. They weren't calling it medicine to make it socially acceptable. They were saying, plainly and openly, that this plant helped them do something important. It helped them grieve. It helped them let go. It helped them remember. It helped them survive the emotional storms that every human being must eventually navigate. In a world without therapists, without antidepressants, Without any of the modern tools we've developed to process loss, the Scythians had this, and it worked well enough that they carried it with them wherever they went. The Scythians were extraordinary travellers. Their horse-based culture allowed them to move enormous distances. Scythian influence stretched from Ukraine to Mongolia, from the edge of the Persian Empire to the fringes of ancient China. Wherever they rode, they took their customs with them. And their cannabis customs, in particular, seemed to travel remarkably well. Because you didn't need a temple to practice them. You didn't need a priest. You didn't need books or scrolls or elaborate architecture. You just needed a tent, some hot stones, a handful of cannabis, and a few friends willing to howl with you. It was the most portable spiritual practice in the ancient world, and so cannabis, riding on the back of Scythian horses, began to spread. Into Persia, into the Balkans, into the outer edges of the Greek world. The Greeks, of course, were horrified. Herodotus wrote about the Scythians with a kind of fascinated disgust, the way modern journalists sometimes cover music festivals. He described the smoke rituals as if he were describing the customs of aliens, and yet, tellingly, he described them in detail. He couldn't look away. There was something magnetic about these tattooed horse riders and their fragrant tents, something that suggested they knew a secret the more civilized peoples had forgotten. There's a specific detail in Herodotus that I love, and I want to share it with you tonight, because it captures something beautiful about early human relationships with cannabis. He wrote that the Scythians used the smoke ritual not just for funerals, but sometimes just because. Sometimes they would set up the tents and gather for no particular occasion. Just to talk, just to share, just to be together in the fragrant warmth. It was the ancient world's version of gathering around a fire pit with old friends, except the fire pit was full of cannabis, and everyone left feeling philosophical. It sounds honestly a bit lovely, a bit like something we've lost and keep trying to rediscover. The Scythian relationship with cannabis also seems to have been genuinely non-hierarchical. There's no evidence that only priests or nobles could participate. Everyone could join. Warriors, women, children in some accounts, elders. The tent was open. The smoke was for everyone. In a world where most religions and rituals were rigidly controlled by specialists, this was radical. It suggested that spiritual experience was not the property of any priesthood. It belonged to anyone brave enough to sit down and breathe. Now, the Scythians eventually faded from history, absorbed by other peoples, defeated by other armies, their vast horse empire dissolving back into the grass from which it had grown. By the time the Roman Empire was hitting its peak, the Scythians were more of a memory than a people. But their cannabis rituals didn't die with them. Other steppe peoples, the Sarmatians, the Alans, the early Turks, and eventually the Mongols, would inherit variations of these practices. The tent, the stones, the smoke, the communal breathing. It kept moving, it kept adapting, it kept quietly influencing every culture that encountered it. And so, while China was refining cannabis into medicine and paper, and while the Scythians were burning it in tents on the endless grass, a third civilization was about to enter our story. A civilization that would take cannabis and do something none of the others had quite done before. They would make it holy. We drift south now, sleepy listener, down through the mountain passes that lead out of Central Asia and into the warm, humid, teeming subcontinent of India. Leave behind the cold winds of the steppe. Leave behind the tidy bureaucracy of Han China. We are entering a different world entirely. A world of monsoon rains and jasmine-scented evenings. A world where cows wander through the streets with the confidence of tenured professors. A world where the gods are not distant figures on cloudy mountaintops, but familiar characters woven into every song, every meal, every quiet moment before sleep. And into this world, cannabis arrived not as a medicine and not as a smoke ritual, but as something the Indian tradition would elevate to a height no other civilization has ever quite matched. They made it a gift from a god. The god in question was Shiva. And if you don't know Shiva, well, you're about to meet one of the most magnificently strange deities in world mythology. Shiva is one of the three great gods of the Hindu tradition, along with Brahma the creator and Vishnu the preserver. Shiva is the destroyer, though that word does not quite capture him. He destroys in order to renew. He is the god of endings that become beginnings. He is the god who dances the universe into ash so that it can be reborn. He lives on Mount Kailash, high in the Himalayas, meditating in the snow, his skin blue with cold and ash. He wears a serpent around his neck. He has a third eye in the middle of his forehead that, when opened, can incinerate anything it looks at. And he is, according to countless ancient stories, extremely fond of cannabis. The Indian tradition holds that Shiva discovered cannabis under a leafy plant one hot afternoon when he was wandering the fields, exhausted from a family quarrel. Even gods have family quarrels, apparently. He plucked a few leaves, chewed them, and felt his weariness melt away. His mood lifted, his thoughts, which had been racing, slowed to a comfortable stroll, and from that moment on, cannabis was his favourite plant. His companion, his fellow wanderer. Devotees of Shiva sometimes call him the Lord of Bhang, which as titles go is really quite something. It's not the kind of thing you'll find written on a business card in most religions. Bhang is worth pausing on, because it's one of the most delightful cannabis preparations in the history of the world. Bhang is not smoked. Bhang is drunk. It's a beverage. Traditionally, it's made by taking cannabis leaves and buds, grinding them into a paste with a mortar and pestle, and then mixing that paste with milk, ghee, sugar, and a handful of aromatic spices like cardamom, fennel, cloves, and rose petals. Sometimes almonds and pistachios are added. The result is a thick, sweet, creamy drink that tastes something like a very indulgent milkshake with a slight herbal note. It's the kind of thing that, if you didn't know what was in it, you would order at a cafe and give a 5-star review. It's the kind of thing your grandmother might make you, if your grandmother happened to be a Himalayan mystic. And the beautiful thing about Bhang is that it wasn't hidden, it wasn't shameful, it wasn't something you had to sneak into a back room to consume. Bhang was, and in many parts of India still is, openly served at religious festivals, especially the festival of Maha Shivaratri, the great night of Shiva. On this night, once a year, devotees stay awake through the darkness, singing hymns, dancing, chanting, and drinking Bhang in enormous quantities. Whole temples buzz with the low murmur of thousands of people slowly slipping into a state that is simultaneously spiritual, joyful, exhausted, and vaguely bewildered. It's beautiful, actually, and no one calls the police. No one clutches their pearls. It is simply understood that on this night, in honour of Shiva, one drinks Bhang and one contemplates the universe. Then one goes home and sleeps for approximately 14 hours. The other great festival where Bhang plays a starring role is Holi, the festival of colours. Holi is a celebration of spring, of the triumph of good over evil, and of the general joy of being alive during the season when everything is blooming. During Holi, people throw brightly coloured powder and water at each other in the streets. Strangers hug strangers. Neighbours who haven't spoken in years reconcile in a shower of pink and yellow dust. And through all of this, Bhang flows freely, mixed into a drink called Thandai. Small children drink the version without cannabis. Adults drink the version with. Elderly aunts drink either, depending on their mood. By evening, half the population of northern India is walking home covered in pigment, giggling gently, and slightly convinced that the trees are more interesting than usual. It is one of the great, joyful, unembarrassed uses of cannabis in human civilization. But cannabis in India was not just a festival drink. It was, and this is what makes India's relationship with the plant unique, genuinely woven into sacred scripture. The Atharva Veda, one of the 4 foundational texts of Hinduism, dating from roughly 1500 BC, lists cannabis as one of the 5 sacred plants. 5 plants, out of all the plants in India, singled out for divine status. Cannabis made that list, It's mentioned alongside barley, which everyone respected because it fed the people. It's mentioned alongside soma, the mysterious ritual plant that scholars still argue about. And there, quietly, is cannabis. Called banga in Sanskrit, praised as a source of joy, a giver of freedom, a companion to the soul, the Atharva Veda calls it a source of happiness, a bringer of freedom, and a giver of joy, which is a lovely, unambiguous endorsement. There's no hemming and hawing, there's no this is medicine officially, but between us it does other things too. It simply says, here is a plant that makes people happy, and it comes from the gods. Try it. Enjoy it. Thank the divine for it, and people, understandably, did. Now, the interesting thing about Indian cannabis culture is how thoroughly integrated it became with mystical practice. Among the yogis and sadhus, the wandering holy men who renounce worldly life to pursue spiritual liberation, cannabis became almost standard equipment. If you travelled through India in almost any century of its long history, you would eventually encounter one of these figures. Thin, ash-covered, hair matted into ropes, walking barefoot along a dusty road with nothing but a begging bowl and a small clay pipe called a chillum. In that chillum would be cannabis, sometimes mixed with tobacco. And as the sun set over the sacred rivers, these holy men would sit down, pack the chillum, and inhale deeply while chanting the name of their beloved god. Bom Shankar. Bom Bholanath, praise to Shiva, praise to the Innocent One, praise to the God who smokes with us. To the outside observer, this might look like drug use in the modern sense, but that's projecting our categories onto their world. To the sadhu, cannabis was not a drug. It was a sacrament. It was a tool. Just as a monk might use a rosary, a candle, or a specific breathing technique to focus the mind, the sadhu used cannabis. It slowed the racing thoughts, it softened the ego, it made the long hours of meditation less physically punishing, and most importantly, it created a kind of loose, receptive state in which spiritual experiences seemed more accessible. Whether that state was truly enlightenment or simply the illusion of enlightenment, well, that's a debate for philosophers with better sleep schedules than either of us. But the point is, in India, cannabis and spirituality grew up together, hand in hand like childhood friends who never lost touch. The traditional Indian medical system, Ayurveda, also incorporated cannabis extensively. Ayurvedic physicians used it for pain, for insomnia, for anxiety, for digestive issues, for coughs, for headaches, for skin conditions, for menstrual difficulties, and for that great catch-all category, general malaise. Cannabis appeared in countless Ayurvedic preparations, sometimes as the primary ingredient, sometimes as a supporting herb. It was ground into pastes, brewed into decoctions, mixed with ghee, and packed into pills. And unlike the Chinese approach, which kept cannabis strictly medicinal, the Ayurvedic tradition was refreshingly relaxed about the plant's more pleasant side effects. If your medicine happened to also improve your mood and give you interesting dreams, well, that was simply good pharmacology. There was even a distinction made between different preparations of cannabis in India, and this shows just how sophisticated the tradition was. Bhang, as we've discussed, was made from the leaves and was considered the mildest form. Ganja, made from the flowering tops of female plants, was stronger and typically smoked. And charas, made from the sticky resin scraped off the plants by hand, was the most potent of all. Prized by yogis and mystics for its power to induce deep meditative states. 3 different preparations, 3 different names, 3 different traditional uses. The Indians understood cannabis better than most cultures ever have, because they'd been living with it, working with it, and drinking it in milkshakes for thousands of years. And through all of this, there was no shame. There was no official condemnation. There was no moral panic. Cannabis was simply part of life, as normal as tea, as everyday as bread. A grandmother might sip a small cup of bhang on a hot afternoon to help her joints. A holy man might smoke a chillum at sunset while watching the river flow. A young couple might share thandai during Holi and laugh until their sides hurt. A grieving family might offer cannabis to the flames during a funeral, sending it along with their departed loved one just as the Scythians had done thousands of years before and thousands of miles away. Same plant, same instinct, different flavour of prayer. The Indian relationship with cannabis lasted essentially unbroken from the Vedic period all the way into the colonial era, when the British would arrive with their peculiar sense of outrage and try, unsuccessfully at first, to regulate it. But that's a story for a later section. For now, imagine India in its long warm middle centuries, when cannabis flowed as freely as the Ganges, when Shiva smiled down from his snowy mountain, and when the smoke of 1,000 chillums rose gently into the evening air like a shared exhale of an entire civilization. Now we drift westward, sleepy listener, out of the fragrant temples of India, across the mountain passes, and down into the ancient lands of Persia. This is a region that has worn many names over the centuries: Persia, Iran, the Achaemenid Empire, the Sassanid Empire, the land between the Tigris and the wine-dark Caspian Sea. Whatever name you use, it was for thousands of years one of the great crossroads of the ancient world. Every trader, every conqueror, every wandering philosopher eventually passed through Persia, and every one of them, it seems, brought a little bit of something with them and left a little bit of something behind. Cannabis was no exception. The Persian relationship with cannabis is one of the most fascinating in ancient history, precisely because Persia was so intellectually restless. This was not a culture content to simply use a plant and be done with it. This was a culture that had to categorize it, philosophize about it, poetize about it, and eventually, inevitably, argue about it. If cannabis in India was a sacrament, and cannabis in China was a medicine, and cannabis among the Scythians was a portable spa treatment, then cannabis in Persia was a question. A very long, very complicated, very interesting question that Persian scholars would spend the better part of 1,000 years trying to answer. The earliest Persian encounter with cannabis probably came through the Scythians, who, as we discussed, rode through the region on their endless nomadic circuits. The Persians called it various things over the years, but one of the most enduring names was bhang, borrowed from the Sanskrit. The word travelled with the plant, which is often the case in history. Cultures inherit vocabulary along with technology. And along with the word came at least some of the associations. That this plant was useful. That this plant was interesting. That this plant did things to the mind that other plants did not. The Zoroastrians, the followers of the ancient Persian religion founded by the prophet Zoroaster around 1500 to 1200 BCE, incorporated cannabis into some of their spiritual practices. Zoroastrianism is one of the oldest continuously practiced religions in the world, and it's a fascinating tradition. It centres on the eternal cosmic struggle between the god of light and truth, Ahura Mazda, and the god of darkness and lies, Angra Mainyu. Every human being, according to Zoroastrian teaching, is caught up in this cosmic drama. Every choice you make, every truth you tell or fail to tell, tips the scales one way or the other. It's a religion of moral urgency and cosmic responsibility. And its priests, who were called magi, were serious men in tall hats who took their duties very seriously indeed. There is a specific reference in the Avesta, one of the sacred texts of Zoroastrianism, to a substance called mang, which many scholars believe was cannabis, sometimes mixed with wine. This mang was used ritually to induce visionary states. The most famous account involves a prophet named Vishtaspa, who reportedly drank a preparation of mang and wine and experienced a divine vision in which he was transported to the heavens and shown the true nature of reality. When he came back, he was so shaken and so convinced of what he had seen that he immediately converted his entire kingdom to Zoroastrianism, which is, if you think about it, quite a return on investment for a single cup of cannabis wine. Now, the Zoroastrian priests were careful with mang. They didn't hand it out to the general public. They didn't have festivals of bhang like the Indians. This was a controlled substance in the truest sense, controlled by the priesthood, used only in specific rituals, meant to give access to divine realms that were considered too dangerous for casual visitors. It's the difference between a sacred wine used only at communion and a bottle you keep in your kitchen. The Persians treated cannabis with a certain reverent caution. They believed it could open doors, yes, but they also believed that not everyone was ready to walk through those doors, and that some of what was on the other side might be genuinely terrifying if you weren't spiritually prepared. As centuries passed and Persian civilization went through its many changes, cannabis remained a quiet, persistent presence. The Persians were extraordinary poets, and their poetry is full of references to intoxication of various kinds. Sometimes they meant wine, sometimes they meant divine love, which they described in the language of intoxication, and sometimes, unmistakably, they meant cannabis. The poet Hafiz, though he lived much later, in the 14th century, drew on a long tradition when he wrote about the state of being drunk on beauty, on God, on the smoke of certain herbs. Persian mystical poetry treats altered consciousness as a metaphor for spiritual awakening, and the metaphor works precisely because so many of the poets and their readers knew exactly what altered consciousness felt like. But the truly wild chapter in Persian cannabis history comes much later, in the medieval period, and it involves one of the most famous and misunderstood groups in world history. The Assassins. Yes, that's where the word comes from. And yes, the story involves cannabis. But almost everything you think you know about it is probably wrong, and tonight, in this quiet moment before sleep, I want to tell you what actually happened. Because the truth is stranger and more interesting than the legend. The story begins in the 11th century, in the remote mountains of northern Persia. A man named Hassan-i-Sabbah founded a religious and political movement based on a particular branch of Shah Islam called Ismailism. Hassan was a brilliant, austere, deeply intelligent leader who saw himself and his followers as defenders of a purer, older form of the faith against what he considered the corrupt religious establishment of his era. He needed a base of operations, and he found one in the most dramatic possible location. A fortress called Alamut, perched on top of an inaccessible mountain crag in the Alborz range. Alamut means eagle's nest, which gives you a sense of the vibe. This was not a place you casually dropped by. This was a place you climbed to with great effort, and only if you were expected. From this mountain fortress, Hassan built one of the most feared political networks of the medieval world. His followers, the Nizari Ismailis, were disciplined, educated, and utterly loyal. When a political enemy needed to be removed, Hassan's followers would infiltrate their target's court, sometimes spending years living as trusted servants or advisors, and then, at the appointed moment, they would strike. A single dagger. A single quiet moment. And then, most remarkably, they would not try to escape. They would stand there, calmly, and accept whatever fate came next. This absolute fearlessness terrified their enemies. It was completely unlike normal warfare. It was a psychological weapon of extraordinary power. Naturally, everyone wanted to know how Hassan produced such devoted killers, and this is where the cannabis legend comes in. The story, as it was told and retold across the medieval world, goes something like this. Hassan would identify promising young men and drug them heavily with hashish, the concentrated resin of the cannabis plant. While they were unconscious, he would have them transported to a hidden garden within Alamut. This garden was designed to look exactly like the paradise promised in the Quran. Flowing streams, beautiful maidens, every imaginable delight. When the young men awoke, they would spend days or weeks in this paradise, being told that they had died and gone to heaven. Then they would be drugged again, transported back out, and told that they had experienced a glimpse of the reward that awaited them if they served Hassan faithfully unto death. Thus, the story went, they became willing to die without hesitation, because they had already seen where they were going. It's a fantastic story, absolutely riveting, and it is almost certainly nonsense. The problem is that there is essentially no evidence for it. It appears in the writings of Marco Polo, who was writing more than 100 years after Hassan's death and had never been anywhere near Alamut. Before Marco Polo, the story doesn't really exist in any coherent form. It seems to have been a legend that grew in the telling, embellished by frightened European crusaders and hostile Muslim chroniclers, who all had reasons to portray the Nizaris as brainwashed drug fiends rather than what they actually were, which was a highly disciplined religious minority with a very effective and very unsettling method of political warfare. The word assassin itself comes from the Arabic hashashin, which some scholars have taken to mean hashish user, but this etymology is also contested. It may have originally been a term of insult used by their enemies to suggest they were riffraff or rabble, not literal cannabis users. The Nizaris themselves never called themselves hashashin. That name was applied to them from outside, by people who did not like them and did not understand them, and were more than happy to spread stories that made them sound sinister and drug-crazed. What is genuinely true is that hashish existed in the Persian world during this era, and it was consumed by various people for various reasons. Sufi mystics, in particular, used it as part of their spiritual practice, much as their Indian counterparts used cannabis. There were hashish dens in the cities of Persia and later throughout the Islamic world, where people would gather to consume, converse, and drift into altered states. Some Islamic religious authorities condemned this, others tolerated it, and a few, quietly, participated, because, as we've seen throughout this history, wherever cannabis goes, humans have complicated feelings about it, and those feelings tend not to be resolved by simple laws. The medieval Islamic world eventually developed a rich and sophisticated debate about cannabis. Was it forbidden by religious law, like wine? Or was it, since it was not specifically mentioned in the Quran, in a different category? Scholars argued about this for centuries. Beautiful legal treatises were written on the subject, and in the end the answer was, essentially, it depends on who you ask. Some regions banned it, others taxed it, others simply ignored it. Which is honestly how most societies eventually deal with cannabis, no matter what era they're in. Now we drift westward again, sleepy listener, following the slow curve of the sun as it moves across the ancient world. Leave behind the mountain fortresses of Persia. Leave behind the Sufi poets and the mystical debates. We are travelling now along one of the great trade routes of human history, a route that would eventually earn a name so evocative that it still stirs the imagination today. The Silk Road, and with our travels, we arrive at one of the most extraordinary civilizations that ever existed. Egypt. Ancient Egypt is a place that, even at a distance of thousands of years, still manages to feel simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Familiar, because we've all seen the pyramids in books and films, we all know the names of Cleopatra and Tutankhamun, we've all been quietly fascinated by mummies at some point in our childhoods. But alien, because when you actually stop and think about how the Egyptians lived, how they thought, how they organised their entire civilization around the certainty of an afterlife, it becomes clear that these were people whose priorities were profoundly different from our own. They built stone monuments meant to last forever. They wrapped their dead in linen and prayers. They spent enormous portions of their national wealth on preparing for a journey that took place after death. It was a civilization that had, in a very real sense, one foot in this world and one foot in the next. And into this world, cannabis arrived quietly, as it always does. We're not entirely sure when it first appeared in Egypt. Some scholars argue it came in through trade with the Near East as early as 2000 BC, possibly earlier. Others suggest it arrived through contact with the peoples further east, and only became widespread later. But by the time of the New Kingdom, roughly 1500 BC onward, cannabis was definitely present in Egyptian society, and it had found its way into one of the most important documents in the history of medicine, the Ebers Papyrus. The Ebers Papyrus is a remarkable document. It's essentially a medical encyclopedia, written around 1550 BC, though it draws on much older sources. It's over 20 metres long when unrolled, which is quite something for a piece of ancient paperwork. It contains hundreds of remedies, diagnoses, incantations, and general medical wisdom accumulated over centuries by Egyptian physicians. And in among all of this, there is a specific reference to a plant called Shemshemet, which most scholars believe was cannabis. It's recommended for a variety of ailments, including inflammation, pain, and memorably sore eyes. That last one is worth pausing on, because it points to something quite remarkable. Modern medicine has confirmed that cannabis can indeed reduce pressure within the eye and is useful in the treatment of glaucoma, which means that Egyptian physicians, without any of the equipment or theoretical framework we now have, somehow figured out that this particular plant helped with this particular condition. How they figured it out, we can only guess. Presumably, some patients somewhere reported that their eyes felt better after taking cannabis, and an alert physician made a note. Multiply that by hundreds of years and dozens of physicians, and you end up with a medical tradition that knew things about plants that we've only recently rediscovered. The Egyptian approach to cannabis was, like the Chinese approach, primarily medical. Egyptian doctors used it in ointments, in salves, in fumigations, in poultices. It was applied externally to wounds and inflammations. It was inhaled to treat coughs and respiratory complaints. It was sometimes taken internally, mixed with honey or beer, to ease pain and induce sleep. Egyptian medicine was surprisingly practical and surprisingly experimental, and cannabis fit right into their pharmacopoeia alongside opium poppy, mandrake, castor oil, and dozens of other plants they had figured out how to use. But there is also evidence, tantalizing though incomplete, that cannabis had ceremonial and religious uses in Egypt as well. Trace amounts of cannabis have been detected in the residue of ancient Egyptian incense burners. Pollen has been found in the wrappings of mummies. In particular, when the mummy of Pharaoh Rameses II, one of the most famous of all Egyptian rulers, was examined in the 20th century, researchers found traces of cannabis in the linen wrappings around his body. Now, this could mean many things. It could mean cannabis was used as part of the mummification process. It could mean cannabis had spiritual significance and was included as a gift for the afterlife. Or it could mean, more prosaically, that hemp fibre was used in some part of the wrapping material and its traces simply lingered. But whichever explanation is true, cannabis was clearly in the vicinity of Egyptian death rituals in a way that suggests it mattered. And the Egyptian afterlife was serious business, sleepy listener. You did not go to the next world unprepared. You went with everything you might possibly need: furniture, food, servants, sometimes literal ones in the older periods, though later they were replaced with small figurines called ushaptis, which is a much more humane arrangement. You went with your favourite objects, your prized possessions, your comforts and consolations. And if cannabis was included in some of these arrangements, then it was because someone thought the deceased might want it, might need it, might find the long journey through the underworld a little easier with a familiar herb close at hand. It's a lovely thought, actually, that across thousands of years and completely different cultures, humans keep making the same quiet gesture. Take this with you. It helped you here. Maybe it will help you there. The Egyptian women had their own particular use for cannabis that deserves mention. There are references in some medical texts to cannabis being used to ease the pains of childbirth. Egyptian midwives were highly skilled practitioners, and they knew a great deal about what worked and what didn't in the exhausting, dangerous business of bringing a new life into the world. Cannabis, mixed with other herbs and sometimes with beer, was one of the tools in their kit. Modern research has shown that cannabis does indeed have analgesic and antispasmodic properties that could plausibly help with the pains and cramping of labour. Whether it was safe to use in this way by modern standards is another question, and one I don't want to dwell on too much, because it's late and we're being cosy. But the point stands. Ancient Egyptian women, in their most vulnerable and important moments, sometimes had cannabis to help them through. And that is, in its own way, a rather touching detail. There is also fascinating evidence that cannabis may have been used cosmetically in Egypt. Egyptians were famously particular about their appearance. They invented eye makeup. They wore elaborate wigs. They perfumed their skin with expensive oils, and it seems that among the many botanical ingredients used in their cosmetic preparations was cannabis. Ointments containing cannabis extracts were rubbed onto the skin to soothe inflammation, treat certain rashes, and perhaps just to make the skin feel soft and comfortable in the dry Egyptian climate. Long before anyone in California was selling CBD skin cream at a marked-up price, Egyptian noblewomen were slathering themselves in something remarkably similar. History rhymes in the most unexpected places. Now, one figure I want to spend a moment on before we move on, because she deserves it, is the goddess Seshat. Seshat was the Egyptian goddess of writing, wisdom, and record-keeping. She is often depicted wearing a headdress that features a 7-pointed star or leaf shape above her head. And some scholars, though this is contested and speculative, have argued that this leaf shape resembles a cannabis leaf. Whether this identification is correct or not, the association is intriguing. A goddess of wisdom and writing, crowned with what may or may not be cannabis. If it is cannabis, then the symbolism is beautiful. Wisdom rising from the herb of contemplation. Knowledge unfolding like a leaf in the light. If it isn't cannabis, well, it's still a lovely image, and it captures something true about the Egyptian relationship with the plant kingdom. They saw the divine in growing things. They understood that plants were not just useful, they were sacred. The Egyptians also traded cannabis extensively along their networks of commerce. Egyptian ships plied the Mediterranean. Egyptian caravans crossed the deserts. Egyptian merchants met with traders from as far away as Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and eventually the Greek city-states. Wherever they went, they brought Egyptian goods and returned with foreign ones. And cannabis, though bulky compared to some other trade items, was part of this exchange. Egyptian hemp cloth was known for its quality. Egyptian medicinal preparations, including those made with cannabis, were sought after across the ancient world. Egypt was, for a very long time, one of the great exporters of pharmaceutical knowledge, and cannabis was part of that export. By the time the Greeks began writing seriously about medicine, they were drawing heavily on Egyptian sources. When Hippocrates and later Galen wrote about the properties of various plants, they were often standing on the shoulders of Egyptian physicians who had come centuries before. This is how knowledge moves through history, sleepy listener. Not in dramatic revelations, but in quiet transmissions. A scroll copied. A conversation between merchants. A recipe passed from a mother-in-law to a daughter-in-law. Cannabis knowledge moved this way for thousands of years, drifting from culture to culture like the smoke it produced when burned. The end of ancient Egypt as an independent civilization came gradually, then all at once. The Persian Empire conquered Egypt. Then Alexander the Great conquered it from the Persians. Then the Ptolemies, Greek descendants of one of Alexander's generals, ruled it for 3 centuries. Then Rome took over. Each of these transitions brought new influences, new practices, new attitudes toward everything, including cannabis. But the plant persisted. The knowledge persisted. And when the ancient world eventually gave way to the medieval world, Egypt would still be one of the great centres of cannabis culture, particularly in the form of hashish, which would become closely associated with Egypt in the centuries to come. But before we get to that, we need to make one more stop on our westward journey. We need to visit a civilization that took cannabis, examined it with characteristic thoroughness, argued about it endlessly, and then wrote about it in ways that would influence Western thinking for the next 2,000 years. We need to visit the Greeks, and the Greeks, as always, are going to have opinions. Now we cross the wine-dark sea, sleepy listener, and arrive on the rocky, sun-drenched shores of ancient Greece. Leave behind the linen-wrapped mummies and the cool corridors of Egyptian temples. We are entering a civilization that could not be more different in temperament. Where the Egyptians whispered in stone and worshipped in silence, the Greeks argued at the top of their lungs, in the open air, and considered a good debate to be the highest form of human activity. Greece was loud. Greece was opinionated. Greece was, in many ways, the birthplace of Western civilization's most enduring habit, which is talking about things until everyone in the room wishes they had never brought it up. The Greeks encountered cannabis through multiple channels. They knew about it from their trade with Egypt. They knew about it from their contact with the Scythians to the north, whom Herodotus described with such vivid, slightly appalled fascination. They knew about it from their own explorations along the Black Sea coast, where wild cannabis grew abundantly and local populations had been using it for centuries. And they knew about it because they were Greeks, and Greeks knew a little about everything, whether they had asked to or not. The Greek intellectual project was essentially to encounter the world and then to categorize it, and cannabis was one of the many, many things they set out to categorize. Herodotus, as we've mentioned, gave us the most famous Greek account of cannabis use, describing the Scythian smoke tents in his sprawling, chatty, endlessly digressive histories. Herodotus lived in the 5th century BC, and he had a remarkable eye for detail and an even more remarkable inability to stay on topic. He would start writing about one thing and end up, 3 chapters later, describing the mating habits of some obscure animal in North Africa. But when he wrote about the Scythians and their cannabis rituals, he was careful, he was clear. He described what he had heard and what he had been told, with a kind of anthropological curiosity that was very unusual for his era. And he preserved for us one of the most detailed accounts of cannabis use in the ancient world. Now, Herodotus was a historian, not a physician. But the Greeks had physicians too, and their physicians took cannabis seriously. The most famous of them was Hippocrates, the man whose oath modern doctors still swear a version of. Hippocrates lived on the island of Kos, and he founded one of the great medical schools of the ancient world. His approach to medicine was radically new for his time. He argued that diseases had natural causes, not supernatural ones. He argued that the body could often heal itself if given the right conditions. He argued that observation and record-keeping were essential to the practice of medicine. All of this seems obvious to us now, but at the time it was quietly revolutionary. Hippocrates and his followers wrote extensively about various plants, including cannabis. In the Hippocratic Corpus, that vast body of writings attributed to Hippocrates and his students, cannabis appears as a treatment for various conditions. Inflammation, earache, what we might now call rheumatism. It was administered in various forms, sometimes as a hot poultice applied to the skin, sometimes as an infusion drunk mixed with wine, sometimes as an oil rubbed onto sore muscles. The Hippocratic physicians were pragmatic. If something worked, they used it. If it didn't, they eventually stopped. And cannabis, whatever its other properties, apparently worked well enough that it earned a permanent place in their toolkit. But of all the ancient Greek writers on cannabis, the most detailed and systematic was a man named Dioscorides. And I want to spend a moment on Dioscorides, sleepy listener, because he is one of my favourite figures in the history of medicine, and hardly anyone remembers him anymore. He lived in the 1st century of the Common Era, which technically makes him more Roman than Greek in political terms, though he wrote in Greek and worked within the Greek medical tradition. He was a physician who served in the Roman army, which meant he travelled extensively. And everywhere he went, he collected plants. He examined them. He interviewed local people about how they used them. He recorded everything he learned in a single monumental work called De Materia Medica, which translates roughly as On Medical Materials. De Materia Medica is one of the most influential books ever written. It catalogued around 600 plants, along with hundreds of animals and minerals, describing their appearance, their properties, and their medical uses. It was so thorough, so useful, and so accurate that it remained the standard reference work for pharmacology in Europe and the Middle East for over 1,500 years. 1,500 years. Think about that. A book written when Rome was still an empire was still being consulted by physicians during the Renaissance. There are very few works of scholarship in human history that have had that kind of staying power. And in De Materia Medica, Dioscorides wrote about cannabis. He distinguished between 2 types, which is fascinating because it shows the sophistication of ancient botanical knowledge. He described what he called the cultivated cannabis, useful primarily for its fibres, which could be made into ropes and cloth. And he described the wild cannabis, which was smaller but which had various medicinal properties, particularly for treating pain and inflammation. He noted that cannabis seeds, if consumed in large quantities, would diminish sexual desire, which is an interesting claim that would echo through the medical literature of subsequent centuries. He recommended cannabis preparations for earache, for treating burns, and for various other conditions. He was careful, methodical, and refreshingly free of moral judgment. Cannabis, to Dioscorides, was simply another useful plant to be understood and applied correctly. Not a demon, not a divine gift, just a plant. The Greek philosophers, of course, had to weigh in, because Greek philosophers had to weigh in on everything, and here we encounter one of the great mysteries of ancient philosophy. Did the philosophers themselves use cannabis? The evidence is frustratingly unclear. There are hints and suggestions, but no definitive proof. Democritus, the philosopher who first proposed the theory of atoms, is said to have used cannabis for its effects on the mind, though this account comes from later sources and may be legendary. Plato does not mention cannabis directly, though he wrote extensively about various forms of divine madness and inspiration. Aristotle, the great cataloguer of everything, mentions cannabis in his botanical writings, but without much personal commentary. So we know that Greek intellectuals knew about cannabis. Whether they personally used it, in the sense that we might use that phrase today, remains uncertain. But here is what I find delightful about Greek intellectual culture. Even without solid evidence of personal use, the philosophical framework they developed for thinking about altered states of consciousness was remarkably open and sophisticated. The Greeks recognized that human beings could enter unusual mental states through various means. Through fasting, through dance, through intense concentration, through wine, of course, which the Greeks embraced with more enthusiasm than any other single substance in their culture, through certain herbs, through the ritual practices of the mystery religions, particularly the famous rites at Eleusis, which used a mysterious drink called kykion that scholars still argue about today. And through these altered states, the Greeks believed human beings could sometimes access truths that were not available to ordinary waking consciousness. This is a remarkably modern-sounding idea, the notion that consciousness has multiple modes, that altered states have their own kind of validity, that certain plants and practices can serve as tools for exploring the mind. The Greeks were not the first to think this way. The Indians had been thinking this way for millennia, and the shamanic traditions across Central Asia had been practicing it for even longer. But the Greeks put it into philosophical language. They argued about it. They wrote it down. And in doing so, they created a framework that Western culture would inherit and continue to argue about ever since. The Greek relationship with cannabis was complicated by their overwhelming preference for wine. Wine was so central to Greek culture that it became a kind of civic identity marker. Greeks drank wine, barbarians drank beer, barbarians smoked strange herbs in tents. This distinction mattered enormously to the Greeks, and it coloured their attitudes toward cannabis. They knew it was useful medicinally. They knew it had interesting properties. But they also associated it, thanks to Herodotus and others, with those wild Scythians in their fragrant tents, and a proper Athenian citizen, drinking his wine at a symposium and discussing the nature of virtue, was not about to start howling with delight in a smoke-filled tent like some sort of nomad. It just wasn't done. So cannabis in Greece occupied an interesting niche. It was known, it was used medicinally, it was written about extensively by the intellectuals, but it was never adopted as a widespread recreational or social practice. It never had a Dionysus. It never got its own festival, the way wine had the Dionysian festivals or the way various herbs had their own celebrations. It stayed in the pharmacy and in the poems and in the philosophical discussions, but it did not become a defining feature of Greek daily life the way it did in India or China. Still, the Greek contribution to cannabis knowledge was enormous. Because of writers like Dioscorides and Hippocrates, the medical uses of the plant were carefully documented and passed down. Because of Herodotus, the cultural practices of other peoples were preserved in vivid detail. Because of the general Greek habit of writing everything down, we have far more information about cannabis in the ancient Greek world than we do about many other contemporary cultures. The Greeks were, in a very real sense, the librarians of the ancient world, and cannabis has a proper shelf in their library. And of course the Greeks passed all of this on to the Romans, who inherited so much from Greek culture, and then, in their characteristic Roman way, made it bigger, more organised, and considerably more expensive. And the Romans had their own relationship with cannabis, one that combined Greek medical knowledge with imperial trade networks and a truly Roman gift for practical application. Now we drift across the Adriatic Sea, sleepy listener, and arrive in the heart of the Mediterranean world during its most bustling and self-important era. Rome, not the ruined city of tourist postcards, with its picturesque broken columns and its cats sleeping on ancient stones. The real Rome. The living Rome. The Rome of 1 million people crammed into apartment blocks, of aqueducts humming with fresh water, of merchants arguing in 17 different languages in the Forum, of legions marching out to conquer or coming home to be paraded. Rome at its peak was one of the largest cities the ancient world ever produced, and it was, in its own way, a marvel of organised chaos. The Romans, like the Greeks before them, were great inheritors of knowledge. They absorbed everything they encountered and then, in their peculiarly Roman way, made it practical. Where the Greeks would write a philosophical treatise about the nature of a plant, the Romans would write a manual about how to grow that plant, how to harvest it efficiently, how to tax it, and how to ensure a steady supply of it for the army. The Roman relationship with almost everything was heavily influenced by logistics. They had an empire to run, and empires require enormous quantities of stuff. Grain to feed the cities, metal for the weapons, cloth for the uniforms, and, as it turned out, hemp for a great many purposes. Rome ran on hemp. That's not an exaggeration, sleepy listener. It's just a fact. The Roman navy alone required staggering quantities of rope, and the best rope was made from hemp. Every Roman warship, every merchant vessel, every fishing boat needed rigging, and the rigging was hemp. Roman soldiers wore hemp cloth as part of their equipment. Roman farmers used hemp cordage for 1,000 daily tasks. Roman engineers used hemp fibres in construction. Roman prisoners were bound with hemp ropes, which is a slightly grim detail but a telling one, because it shows how thoroughly this plant was woven into the everyday fabric of Roman life. The Romans imported hemp from wherever they could get it, which by the height of their empire meant more or less everywhere. From Egypt, from the Black Sea region, from Gaul, from Britain. Roman merchants moved bales of hemp along the same trade routes that carried grain and olive oil and wine. And when they conquered new territories, one of the first things they did was assess the local hemp production and figure out how to integrate it into the imperial supply chain. It was not glamorous work. It was not the kind of thing that made it into the epic poems. But it was the quiet, essential foundation upon which Roman power actually rested. Now, when it came to the other uses of cannabis, the medicinal and the recreational, the Romans had inherited the full Greek tradition. Dioscorides, whom we spent time with in the last section, was actually working within the Roman world when he wrote his great pharmacology. His work was immediately adopted by Roman physicians and became one of the standard references throughout the empire. Roman doctors, working in cities from Britain to Syria, would consult Dioscorides when they needed to know how to prepare a cannabis remedy for a soldier with a painful joint or a wealthy patron with a persistent earache. The most famous Roman physician after Dioscorides was Galen, who lived in the 2nd century of the Common Era. Galen was a fascinating figure. He was born in what is now Turkey, trained in Alexandria, spent time as a physician to gladiators, and eventually became the personal doctor to several Roman emperors. He was brilliant, prolific, and famously certain of his own opinions. He wrote about medicine with the confidence of a man who has never seriously doubted himself, which made his works both authoritative and at times wildly wrong. But when he was right, he was very right, and his influence on Western medicine lasted well over 1,000 years. Galen wrote about cannabis in several of his medical works. He described it as a food, noting that in some regions people made a kind of dessert from cannabis seeds, mixing them with other ingredients, and serving them at the end of a meal. He mentioned that eating these confections in small quantities produced a pleasant warmth and stimulation, but that eating them in excess could cause headaches, drying of the body, and other unpleasant effects. This is one of the earliest recorded descriptions of what we might now recognise as the difference between a mild dose and an overdose of edible cannabis. And it captures something that anyone who has ever eaten too many cannabis edibles knows to be true. Moderation, as always, is a virtue. Galen also mentioned that certain Roman households served cannabis-infused sweets at fashionable dinner parties. Wealthy Romans, always eager to impress their guests with exotic delicacies, would offer these treats after the main courses, along with fruits and nuts and small cups of sweet wine. The guests would nibble, converse, and enjoy the gentle euphoria that accompanied the digestion of these preparations. It was, in effect, a very early version of the cannabis edible, and it took place in some of the grandest dining rooms of the ancient world, among senators and generals and their perfumed wives, all being terribly civilized about the whole thing. History, you see, is full of moments like this. The past is not always as different from the present as we imagine. But the Romans, like most cultures, had their contradictions. While cannabis edibles were served at elegant dinner parties, the general Roman attitude toward intoxication was suspicious. Wine was accepted, celebrated even, because it had been part of Roman culture from the beginning, and because it was thoroughly integrated into their religious practices. But other substances were viewed with more caution. The idea of losing control, of behaving like a barbarian, of surrendering one's dignity to some foreign drug, that was not the Roman way. Romans prided themselves on their gravitas, their weighty seriousness, their capacity for self-control. A Roman gentleman did not giggle at nothing. A Roman gentleman did not have visions. A Roman gentleman drank his wine, made his sharp political observations, and went home to bed at a reasonable hour. So cannabis, while widely known and used medicinally, occupied a slightly ambivalent position in Roman culture. It was there. It was accepted. But it was not celebrated the way wine was celebrated. It did not have its own festivals. It did not have its own god. Bacchus and Dionysus got all the temples and all the songs, while cannabis quietly did its work in the background, curing earaches and sweetening desserts and holding up the sails of the empire's ships. There is one Roman writer I want to mention specifically, because his description of cannabis is charming and human. His name was Pliny the Elder, and he was one of those extraordinary Romans who managed to combine several full careers into a single lifetime. He was a military commander. He was an imperial administrator. He was an author. He was a naturalist. He died, memorably, while trying to rescue people from the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 C, going down to the shore in a small boat to help evacuate refugees and being overcome by volcanic fumes. He was, in every sense, a man of enormous energy and curiosity. Pliny wrote a book called The Natural History, which attempted to catalogue everything known about the natural world. It's a sprawling, unreliable, endlessly fascinating work that mixes accurate observation with fantastical rumour. He wrote about cannabis several times, describing its uses in rope-making, its medicinal properties, and, in one memorable passage, its effect on the human body. He noted that the plant had two forms, male and female, and that the female plant was more useful for producing seeds, while the male plant was more useful for producing fibres. Modern botany would later confirm that cannabis is indeed a dioecious plant, meaning it has separate male and female individuals, and that the two sexes do indeed have different practical uses. Pliny got this right, working from observation and interviews with growers, without any of the scientific apparatus we now take for granted. Pliny also mentioned that cannabis was thought to be effective against certain kinds of parasites, and that a decoction of the roots was used to treat gout and joint pains. He described the plant in a matter-of-fact way, without moralizing, treating it as one of many useful growing things that thoughtful Romans should know about. This tone is characteristic of Roman writing on cannabis. It's practical, it's calm, it doesn't get worked up. In this respect, the Romans were considerably more relaxed about the plant than certain later civilizations would prove to be. The Roman legions, marching across Europe and North Africa, spread cannabis wherever they went, not because they were trying to spread it, but because it hitched a ride with them. Hemp seeds fell out of ropes. Cannabis grew wild in the disturbed soil around Roman camps. Everywhere the legions built roads and forts, cannabis quietly took root in the vicinity. By the time the Roman Empire was at its greatest extent, cannabis was growing from Britain to the deserts of the Middle East, from the shores of the Black Sea to the fields of Spain. The empire had, entirely without meaning to, become one of the great distributors of cannabis in world history. There is a particularly interesting archaeological find worth mentioning here. In a Roman-era tomb in Beit Shemesh, in what is now Israel, archaeologists discovered the body of a young woman who had apparently died in childbirth. Near her remains they found a small container of what appears to be cannabis residue. The current interpretation is that she was probably being given cannabis to ease the pain of a difficult labour, and that despite this attempt to help her, both she and her baby died. It's a sad detail, and I share it because it puts a very human face on ancient cannabis use. This wasn't just about philosophy and trade routes. It was about real people, in real pain, being given the best help their culture could offer. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. The Roman Empire, of course, eventually collapsed. It didn't happen all at once. It happened in slow motion, over centuries, as the western half fractured and fell to various invading peoples, while the eastern half, centred on Constantinople, would continue for another 1,000 years as the Byzantine Empire. But the Roman world that had known and used cannabis so widely gradually gave way to something new. The classical world was ending, and with it, at least in Europe, the long, easy medicinal familiarity with cannabis was beginning to fade. Section 910. Now we drift into the long, strange centuries that historians used to call the Dark Ages, though modern scholars have mostly stopped using that phrase because it was unfair and inaccurate. Better to call them the early medieval centuries, a time of enormous change, of collapsing empires and rising kingdoms, of new religions spreading across continents, of quiet villages and loud invasions. In Europe, the Roman world was gone, and something new was slowly, painfully taking its place. But in other parts of the world, entirely different stories were unfolding, and cannabis, patient as always, was there in all of them. Let us go first to the Islamic world, sleepy listener, because this is where cannabis was about to have one of its most remarkable adventures. The Prophet Muhammad lived in the 7th century, in the deserts of Arabia, and the religion he founded spread with astonishing speed across the Middle East, North Africa, and eventually into parts of Europe and Central Asia. Within 100 years of Muhammad's death, Muslim armies had conquered a territory that stretched from Spain to the borders of India. It was one of the most rapid expansions in human history, and with it came a new civilization, one that would preserve and expand upon the medical, philosophical, and scientific knowledge of the ancient world at a time when much of Europe was in the process of forgetting it. Islamic culture and cannabis had a complicated relationship from the very beginning, and it's worth understanding why. The Quran, the holy book of Islam, explicitly forbids the consumption of wine and other intoxicants. This is a clear and unambiguous prohibition. But the Quran does not specifically mention cannabis. It doesn't mention it as forbidden, it doesn't mention it as permitted, it simply doesn't mention it at all. Which meant that, for centuries, Islamic scholars would argue about whether the prohibition on wine also applied to other substances that produced altered states, or whether cannabis existed in some sort of legal grey area outside the explicit rules. The result was one of the most sustained and sophisticated debates about cannabis ever conducted by any civilization. Islamic scholars wrote entire treatises on the subject. They argued about the physiological effects of the plant. They argued about whether it truly caused intoxication in the same sense as wine did. They argued about whether it was actually a food, since it could be eaten as well as smoked. They argued about whether it might be a medicine, in which case its use would be permitted for therapeutic purposes. They argued about whether it was a legitimate spiritual tool used by the Sufis or whether it was a corruption that led people away from proper religious practice. These debates went on for centuries, and they produced some of the most detailed philosophical writing about cannabis that has ever existed. And while the scholars debated, ordinary people did what ordinary people have always done. They used the plant. They used it in various forms and for various reasons, sometimes discreetly and sometimes openly, depending on where they lived and what the local authorities thought about it. Because the Islamic world was vast and diverse, attitudes varied enormously from place to place. In some regions, cannabis was tolerated or even celebrated. In others, it was strictly prohibited. In still others, it was officially banned but unofficially available to anyone who knew where to look. This patchwork of regulations and practices would continue essentially unchanged into modern times, and it's one of the reasons cannabis has such a rich and complex history in the Muslim world. The Islamic Golden Age, roughly from the 8th to the 13th centuries, was a period of extraordinary intellectual flourishing. In cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba, scholars gathered to translate Greek and Persian and Indian texts, to conduct original research in mathematics and astronomy and medicine, and to build one of the greatest intellectual traditions the world has ever seen. Cannabis was very much part of this world. Islamic physicians inherited the medical writings of Dioscorides and Galen, translated them into Arabic, and then extended and refined them with their own observations. The great Persian physician Avicenna, who lived around the year 1000, wrote about cannabis in his Canon of Medicine, one of the most influential medical texts in world history. He described its uses, its dosages, and its cautions with the same careful attention he gave to every other substance in his Pharmacopoeia. But it wasn't just physicians who paid attention to cannabis in the Islamic world. It was also the Sufis, the mystical wing of Islam. Sufis were and are Muslims who pursue a particularly intense, personal, experiential form of religious practice. They seek direct union with the divine, often through techniques like ecstatic dance, rhythmic breathing, repetitive chanting, and, in some traditions, the use of cannabis. Sufi poetry is filled with references to intoxication, sometimes literal and sometimes metaphorical, and the great Sufi poets like Rumi wrote lines that can be read as much as descriptions of divine ecstasy as of anything more earthly. Whether Rumi himself used cannabis, we don't know for certain, but the tradition he participated in certainly did, and it produced some of the most beautiful mystical literature ever written. There is a lovely story from this period about a Sufi named Haydar, who lived in the 12th or 13th century. According to the legend, Haydar was a solitary mystic who lived in the mountains, spending his days in prayer and meditation. One day he wandered into a field where cannabis was growing wild. He noticed that on this particular hot afternoon, all the plants were drooping in the heat, except for the cannabis plants, which seemed to be dancing gently in the sun. Curious, he plucked some leaves and chewed them. Soon he was in a state of unusual joy and peace. When he returned to his disciples, they were startled by his radiant expression and pressed him to reveal what had happened. He told them about the plant. They begged him to share the secret. And thus, according to the legend, Haydar became the patron saint of Islamic cannabis users. Whether the story is literally true is beside the point. What matters is that it captures something about the Sufi relationship with the plant. It was a discovery, a gift, a path toward the divine, and it was seen as coming from God, not despite religious practice, but as part of it. Meanwhile, in Europe during these same centuries, cannabis was following a quieter and more limited path. The Roman traditions of cannabis medicine had largely been forgotten in the Western Roman world, though they were preserved and continued in the Byzantine Empire and in Islamic Spain. In most of Christian Europe, cannabis was known primarily as a fibre crop. Hemp was grown extensively, and it was as essential to European life as it had been to Roman life. Hemp ropes rigged the ships that sailed the North Sea and the Atlantic. Hemp cloth clothed peasants and soldiers alike. Hemp paper, once the technology arrived from the East, revolutionized European scholarship and eventually made possible the printing revolution of the 15th century. But the recreational and mystical uses of cannabis largely disappeared from European culture during the medieval period. This is one of the great puzzles of cannabis history. The plant that had been used medicinally throughout the Roman world and that continued to be used medicinally in Islamic lands somehow got mostly forgotten in Europe. There are various theories about why this happened. Perhaps the disruptions of the fall of Rome broke the chains of medical knowledge. Perhaps the rise of Christianity, with its suspicion of anything smacking of pagan religious practice, discouraged the use of psychoactive plants. Perhaps European climate simply wasn't as favourable for the cultivation of cannabis with high psychoactive content, since colder climates tend to produce plants that are better for fibre than for other purposes. Whatever the reason, cannabis in medieval Europe was mainly a fibre, mainly a rope, mainly a very useful and very unglamorous agricultural product. There were exceptions. Medieval herbalists occasionally mentioned cannabis in their writings, usually drawing on the classical sources they still had access to. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century German abbess who was also a physician and a mystic, mentioned cannabis in her herbal writings, describing it as useful for the stomach and for various pains. Monastery gardens sometimes included cannabis among their medicinal plants. And in various folk traditions across Europe, cannabis retained a place in home remedies and in the wisdom of village healers, particularly for pain relief and for the difficulties of childbirth. But this was folk knowledge, not scholarly knowledge, and it did not receive the kind of systematic attention that Islamic physicians were giving to the plant during the same centuries. While Europe kept its distance from the more interesting uses of cannabis, other parts of the world were developing their own rich traditions. In Africa, cannabis was spreading south from Egypt and North Africa into sub-Saharan regions, where various peoples were developing their own distinctive practices around the plant. In Ethiopia, in particular, there is evidence of cannabis use dating back many centuries. The practice of smoking cannabis, either alone or mixed with tobacco once tobacco arrived from the Americas, would eventually become widespread across much of Africa. Water pipes, similar to the hookahs of the Middle East, would be developed to make the smoking of cannabis more efficient and more pleasant. And across the continent, cannabis would find its place in traditional medicine, in ritual practice, and in the daily lives of ordinary people. In China, meanwhile, the ancient tradition of cannabis medicine continued, though the plant had largely lost its mystical associations by the medieval period. Chinese physicians continued to use cannabis for pain relief, for various inflammatory conditions, and for a range of other complaints. But the Taoist rituals that had once used cannabis smoke to commune with spirits had faded, replaced by other spiritual practices that did not require pharmacological assistance. Chinese cannabis had become, by this period, almost entirely a medicinal and agricultural plant, useful and important but no longer sacred. And in India, of course, the great tradition continued largely unchanged. Bang was still drunk at Holi and Maha Shivaratri. Yogis and sadhus still smoked their chillums at sunset. The relationship between cannabis and Hindu spirituality remained as strong as it had been for thousands of years. India, in a sense, preserved the fullest expression of humanity's ancient relationship with the plant, even as other cultures had moved on or moved away. And now, sleepy listener, we arrive at the final chapter of our long, slow journey through the ancient history of cannabis. We have travelled from the Stone Age campfires of Central Asia to the golden bowls of Scythian tombs. We have wandered through Chinese apothecaries and Indian temples, through Persian mountain fortresses and Egyptian embalming chambers, through Greek philosophical schools and Roman dinner parties, through Islamic medical libraries and medieval hemp fields. 10,000 years of quiet human relationship with a single plant. And as we near the end of our tale, we come to the moment when the ancient world begins to give way to something we might recognise as the beginning of the modern world. The age of exploration, the age of empire. The age when cannabis, having spent its first several millennia patiently spreading across the old world, was about to embark on the most dramatic expansion of its long career. The story begins, as so many stories of this era do, with ships. Great wooden ships, three-masted and seaworthy, ready to cross oceans that no European had ever crossed before. And what were those ships made of, sleepy listener? What held them together mile after mile, wave after wave, across storms and calms and the vast blue emptiness of the open sea? The answer, of course, is hemp. Cannabis, the same plant that had been used for rope-making since the Stone Age, was now being used to rig the vessels that would sail into the age of exploration and change the world forever. A single large sailing ship of the 16th or 17th century required enormous quantities of hemp. The sails were often made of hemp canvas, though flax was also used. The rigging, all those ropes and cables that controlled the sails and held the masts steady, was almost entirely hemp. The caulking that sealed the seams between the planks was mixed with hemp fibres. The nets used by the sailors, the ropes used to lower the anchor, the cordage used for 1,000 daily tasks aboard ship, all of it was hemp. It has been estimated that a single large warship of the era might contain 50 or 60 tons of hemp products. 50 tons per ship. Multiply that by all the ships built during the great age of European exploration and colonization, and you begin to understand why hemp was one of the most strategically important agricultural products in the world. European governments understood this perfectly well. They passed laws requiring farmers to grow hemp. In 16th century England, King Henry VIII decreed that every landowner had to devote a portion of their fields to hemp cultivation or face significant fines. Queen Elizabeth I strengthened this law, essentially making hemp cultivation a patriotic duty. Across Europe, similar policies were adopted. Governments needed hemp for their navies, and their navies were the instruments of their power. Without hemp, there was no naval expansion. Without naval expansion, there was no empire. It's not too much to say that the modern world was built, quite literally, on cannabis, and as European ships sailed to new continents, they carried hemp seeds with them. Wherever they established colonies, they planted hemp. The English brought hemp to North America, the Spanish brought it to Central and South America, the Portuguese brought it to Brazil, the Dutch brought it to South Africa and Indonesia. Within a few generations of the first European settlements in the Americas, hemp was being grown from the northern reaches of Canada to the tip of Argentina. And thus cannabis, which had originated in Central Asia and spread throughout the Old World over the course of 10,000 years, completed its conquest of the entire planet in just a few centuries of colonial expansion. The story in North America is particularly interesting, sleepy listener, because it involves some names you might recognize. Many of the founding figures of the United States were, among their other occupations, hemp farmers. George Washington grew hemp at Mount Vernon, Thomas Jefferson grew hemp at Monticello. The early economies of Virginia and Kentucky were significantly built on hemp production, and this hemp was used for exactly the same purposes it had been used for throughout ancient history. Ropes, sails, sacks, paper, cloth. The American Declaration of Independence was drafted, according to some traditions, on hemp paper. Whether or not that particular story is true, it is certain that hemp was a normal, unremarkable, deeply integrated part of American colonial and early national life. But something was happening during these same centuries that would eventually transform humanity's relationship with cannabis. In the Islamic world, the tradition of consuming cannabis for its psychoactive effects, either through hashish or through various infused preparations, had continued and even expanded. And when European travellers and colonial administrators began to encounter these practices, they were often horrified. They wrote reports back to their home countries describing hashish dens, cannabis using Sufis, and various other practices that they found alarming. These reports, filtered through the biases and misunderstandings of their authors, would eventually help form the foundation of the modern Western attitude toward cannabis. An attitude that treated it not as a useful medicine or a normal part of daily life, but as a dangerous foreign substance associated with strange peoples and unsettling customs. The transition from cannabis as ordinary agricultural product to cannabis as controlled substance took several centuries and was influenced by many factors: colonial encounters, racial anxieties, economic competition with alternative fibre crops like cotton, changing medical fashions, and by the 20th century, most of the world would find itself in a strange situation. A plant that had been used continuously by humans for 10,000 years, that had been documented as medicine by ancient Chinese and Greek and Roman and Arab physicians, that had been sacred to Hindus and Sufis and countless other spiritual traditions, that had literally rigged the ships that carried Europeans around the world. This plant would suddenly become illegal in most countries. It's one of the strangest reversals in the history of human relationships with the natural world, and it happened within living memory more or less in the great sweep of things. But that story, sleepy listener, that story of prohibition and reform, of moral panics and medical reconsiderations, that story belongs to modern history. We have been travelling through the ancient world tonight, through the long, slow, patient centuries when cannabis and humanity grew up together. And I want to bring us gently back, before we drift into sleep, to some of the images and moments we have visited. Picture, if you will, the Stone Age hunter, tossing a handful of cannabis onto a fire without knowing what he was doing, and watching the smoke rise into the cold Siberian sky. Picture the Chinese Emperor Shen Nung, mythical or not, carefully tasting a leaf and recording its effects in the world's first medical text. Picture the Scythian mourners, gathered in their felt tents, howling with delight as fragrant smoke filled the air, and they felt, for one long strange evening, that they could speak to their dead. Picture the Indian yogi, ash-covered and thin as a stick, sitting beside the Ganges at sunset with his small clay chillum, chanting the name of Shiva as smoke rose from his lips. Picture the Persian Zoroastrian priest, drinking his cup of mang mixed with wine, closing his eyes, and seeing the heavens open above him. Picture the Egyptian midwife, mixing cannabis into a preparation for a young woman crying out in the pains of labour. Picture Dioscorides, walking through a Roman herb garden with his notebook, carefully cataloguing every plant he found. Picture the Sufi Haydar, discovering cannabis in his mountain field and running back to his disciples with the news. Picture the medieval hemp farmer in an English village, harvesting his crop, sending it off to the naval yards where it would become part of the ropes that rigged the ships of empire. All of these images are moments in a single long story, the story of a plant and a species who have known each other for as long as we have been recognisably human. Cannabis has been our companion through fire and famine, through war and peace, through the rise and fall of every empire we have ever built. It has been medicine and material, sacrament and snack, philosophy and simple pleasure. It has travelled with us to every continent. It has learnt to grow in every climate we can inhabit. It has quietly outlasted every civilization that ever tried to control it. And it will presumably outlast us too, growing patiently in some sunny field long after we are all gone. There is something oddly comforting about that thought, sleepy listener, not because there is anything sad about our own eventual disappearance, but because it reminds us that we are part of something much longer and larger than ourselves. Our lives are brief, our anxieties are small, but cannabis was here when the first humans learned to make fire, and it will be here when the last humans finally set the fire down. In between, we get to know it briefly. We get to argue about it, use it, ban it, celebrate it, and eventually pass it on to whoever comes next. It is our oldest botanical friend, and possibly our most misunderstood. Tonight we have followed its journey from Central Asia to every corner of the ancient world. We have watched it become sacred and profane, medicinal and mystical, ordinary and extraordinary, all depending on where and when humans encountered it. We have seen how the same plant could be a sacrament in one place and a suspicion in another, how it could rig the ships of empires and heal the wounds of gladiators, how it could be smoked in Scythian tents and sipped in Indian temples and rubbed onto the aching joints of Roman senators. It is, in the end, one of the truly great stories of human civilization, and it happened almost entirely in the background, while emperors and kings took the credit for their more visible achievements. So the next time you hear someone talking about cannabis, whether in praise or in condemnation, remember that they are talking about something 10,000 years older than any political opinion they might have about it. Something that predates every religion, every nation, every language currently spoken on Earth. Something that has been with us since before we were us. That deserves, at minimum, a moment of quiet respect. And perhaps, on a sleepy night like this, a small smile of recognition. An old companion. An older story. 10,000 years of smoke and thread and shared human evenings. Thank you for travelling with me tonight, sleepy listener. If you enjoyed this slow, meandering ramble through ancient history, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. Let me know in the comments what part of the story surprised you, or which ancient civilization you found most intriguing. Sleep well, sleep deeply, and may your dreams be gentle, herbal, and only slightly philosophical.